Where is your strategy now in terms of producing or changing weights and changing baskets? And how do you think it's playing out compared to how we thought it would play out?
Uh, so let me start. I mean, I was so far I have been. So when this started, I was very concerned about about the sort of meaningfulness of lots of our indicators. I could quickly think of lots of challenges, and that wasn't just inflation, but lots of other areas where I thought, actually, are we going to be able to produce something meaningful? And it was at that level of challenge was my initial concern. So far, I think what we have produced has been probably better than I was expecting. Now, and on inflation, it's a really interesting one, because I was really nervous that we would see very large changes in prices across the basket in such a way that it would mean actually it wasn't meaningful. So, the things that weren't available would, or the things that people weren't consuming would go down fast in price, and things people were consuming would actually go up, and because there was high demand, prices would be pushed up, and it would really distort it. All the work we've done so far, and we've done attempts at reweighting baskets of different degrees of sophistication, suggests those effects were pretty small. The big one early on was petrol and diesel. The oil price competed with us for the most extraordinary chart in history. Next to our GDP chart, I think the oil price chart from early on was perhaps the and so that perhaps
when it turned negative, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So so and when we've done various scenarios, it's not suggested there's been much of a challenge. I think the work we did most recently suggested you could add 0.2 to I think at most to the measure of inflation, and I think some of that is due to actually outside the areas of, say, fuel, actually, and things we talked about seasonally, like clothing or airfares or things like that. Actually, lots of prices haven't really changed. There hasn't been big changes in prices. So we now do a weekly grocery basket scanner data. Sorry, no, it's using web scrape data, and that doesn't show much change at all. So I think some of it's been to the nature of that. I think so. And it's interesting. The more I've thought about, there's sort of been two, I think, uses of inflation, and Martin will sort of correct me for my sort of inexactitude here, probably. I think there's been a sort of sense of you want inflation as a long-term measure. It's a sort of structural economic measure. And our current approach of a fixed basket, annually chain-linked approach does that. And I think that is useful in the sense of providing that structural indicator, because economic statistics are about the here and now, but they're also about kind of over the long run do they add up. But there was a need. I think there is this sort of need and interest in kind of what's happening here and now. And now most of the time those two coincide through CPI or CPIH, but they haven't. They haven't here. But actually, I think that's. So I think that's it's remained robust. In terms of the future, I think this is kind of, our next steps, and the work we've got in plan is, for example, to use supermarket scanner data to start getting into this. And in that way, you wouldn't quite have explicit reweighting of the basket, because the higher level weights between, say, groceries and, fuel or furniture or whatever wouldn't stay the same. But within item, if you've got quantities as well as prices, you are essentially modeling what is going on in real time. And in many ways, if the crisis, if the pandemic had hit us, in 12 months' time, we would be further down that path with scanner data and would be able to do more with that. So I think the direction of travel is to use more high frequency, more comprehensive data in inflation measurement. I haven't really thought through whether that really bridges the gap. I don't think it does fully, but I think it would give us a bit more insight. So you could sort of see if people were migrating from, say, higher priced food items, and because their budgets were constrained, they were going to cheaper items. You would actually be able to see that within the scanner data, and we would be able to take that take some of that into account. So I think if we had that richer source of data, we would be getting there quicker. We'd be adding insight, and I think it would make some of these problems a little bit easier. But that's my sort of take on kind of where we are. But in general, and there are still risks. Don't get me wrong. There are risks around our economic statistics on GDP and the labour market, because of all the data collection challenges and all the conceptual issues. But in general, they have held up very, very, perhaps better than we might have expected at the start of the pandemic.
Okay, in light of that, do you see the direction of travel as being producing alternative baskets going forward?
Yeah,
continuity measures alongside alternative baskets.
Yeah.
Or is it to try and get the headline numbers underneath, when you look down into the detail of what's going on, having that changing faster?
I think it will be. I think the answer is to is to actually have more of these alternative baskets or alternative constructions. I think, and even when we came to recalculate, I won't get into the technicalities, but when we came to recalculating the basket for changing consumption patterns, we suddenly realized actually if we did this, actually you have to have, it actually changes the nature of, it's kind of, inflation is not, most people see it as a thing, just one thing, but actually the way you construct it, the formula you used, how you do the chain linking, all of these things contribute to it. So it was almost, one of the things I was quite clear about is kind of when we decided to do this updated basket, it's not that you really update the basket, it's you bring a whole new method in. So and so I'm very nervous about bringing whole new methods in to core measures like CPI or CPIH. I would rather do experimental or data series alongside that allow us to understand, and we can take much more risk with. Because I fear if you try and change the main measure, you will end up with some compromise that sort of is half one thing and half another. And I'd rather keep very clear concepts that CPIH is this, or CPI is this longer structural measure, and then do some variation around it rather than try and make CPI or CPIH all things to all people. So that's kind of where I'm sort of, that's kind of my sort of mindset. So, I don't know, Martin, you've been close to some of these things. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I completely agree with Jonathan that while eventually you might want to change CPI, certainly any alternative is something that you would have to test very well and for a long time before you contemplated that. And I think the ONS makes very good use of the concept of experimental statistics. But if I could say that there's one issue that isn't addressed simply by changing the weights, and that's really how you produce an index which reflects the goods that are unavailable during lockdown. What price do you put in for a pint of beer when the pubs are closed so you can't go out for a pint of beer? And one way of answering that is to estimate a demand system and calculate what tax rate on beer would reduce the demand effectively to zero. And that, of course, during the tight phase of the lockdown would have given rather higher prices, which would then have come down again. Now, you might say, well, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks, but given that the lockdown was a relatively brief period, you could produce a coherent argument that actually that, doing what I described shouldn't have been an ONS priority and wasn't an ONS priority. But there is nevertheless a conceptual issue about the changes in spending patterns. If people go on holiday less, they spend less on foreign travel. That's perhaps one of the more persistent changes that we're likely to see. Then should that be reflected as a hidden tax on foreign travel? So there are broader issues than simply reflecting the weight of actual spending. On the issue of how you might reflect the weight of actual spending, I suppose I'm starting to think that when people look at GDP, and listening to the conference, some statistical offices are thinking in this way. They produce flash indicators based on forecasting and nowcasting techniques. Of course, ONS is doing that for regional GDP. So why shouldn't we think of applying forecasting and nowcasting techniques to produce up-to-date weights of consumption shares? I'm not saying that that would be straightforward. It might be impractical or add nothing, but so far it's simply been seen as a measurement problem, and I'm just wondering whether there's some gain in seeing it as a nowcasting or forecasting problem. Well, that's an issue to think about over the next few months.
And Jonathan, from your point of view, is that a realistic project to try and move to a kind of nowcasting, a real-time updating of consumption?
I think in some ways there's no reason why not. I think you would want to think carefully. As I said, there's a sort of, I think there's a bit of a challenge here. In most normal times, I think the idea of doing nowcasting, you tend to see gradual changes. Yes, you see changes in expenditure patterns, but normally a lag of 2 years, which is normally what we would normally have, is not that problematic. Would you get very much more from nowcasting, up to the January of the year in question? You might well do, and there is some evidence. I've seen some evidence, for example, that the fact that some people don't do that creates a little bit of a bias, because it tends to be the goods goods that are getting cheaper, you tend to have a lower share of. So but normally that would be very marginal, because the consumption patterns don't change that very much. As I said, if you then want to do it into real-time consumption patterns, you are fundamentally if you want to do it on sort of idea of a monthly chain-linked measure, you really are changing CPI very much. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out, but I think in most normal times you would have to think about kind of, again, the challenge here is the more sophisticated your method, yes, you might get a bit of accuracy, but are you introducing some other source of error, and also is it explicable? Because again, you always want, as always, part of the challenge here is being able to explain this, to explain that our expenditure weights have done this and they're now casted up to this using this particular formula, could be a bit of a communication challenge.
It's an interesting one, because certainly there's not been much mainstream debate about possible distortions in inflation and so on. Same time, you talk to the experts, talk to the Bank of England and others, and they are looking at it very closely. Policymakers look at it closely. Is this where we end up with different measures for different audiences?
I think
statistics become the measures for the expert users, and you have these headline measures which aren't.
I think it's difficult at the moment, because I think certainly I think the bank has been looking at a huge number of different measures, but again, I think personally I sort of think there is a lot of value in CPIH, because it's not affected it is a sort of structure. In some ways, it's a structural measure, and therefore that tells you something. Now, it doesn't tell you everything, but tells you something. So I think it will be a suite of, and again, I think there's always going to be a suite of measure. I think there's a sort of, I think there's very much a human desire always to want to have a single number that tells us that does everything. And you sort of see it in some of these human development indices where you have these sort of weighted concepts, and I've always been a little bit dubious of them because it feels like we're trying to oversimplify. So I think there will be a suite of measures, just as if you look at certainly I know when US inflation gets reported, there's a lot of focus not just on the headline but on the core and then variations within that. So I think you do need to sort of disentangle the different, and I wouldn't, I think that's kind of what I would expect the bank to be doing, and not just responding to a single number.
Well, I mean, if I could say on that I agree with Jonathan that there needs to be a suite of measures, and of course there is already a suite of measures with a single headline figure. But if we think of the CPI, RPI, issue that occupied, even if not been the prime event for 10 years of my life, and that is close to resolution now, but that does demonstrate the problems of having multiple horses running at the same time, unless you explain very clearly what each of them does. Now, the problem with RPI, CPI was that people had thought RPI was a perfectly good measure until we discovered that it wasn't. So that was a sort of difficulty which I don't think we would have with other price indices in conjunction with CPI, because as Jonathan said, we can explain what CPI does. We can explain that other things are trying to do something different rather than better. I mean, one point I would mention is that Paul Johnson's review did suggest that there would be merit in the ONS producing superlative price indices with a lag, and these would reflect the changes in the basket. That's why, using the data that Paul was talking about, they would have been produced with a lag, and they would tell you whether in normal times there were material biases in CPI or not.
Yeah.
Okay, come back to that point. It's a very good point about the CPI, RPI. I mean, obviously one mistake there was RPI being enshrined in legislation. So the question whether you actually could change it. But in practical terms, are we always going to assume that what you're going to link gilt to, what you're going to use for public sector pay rises and the like, what you're going to use for wage rises will never be an experimental number, can only ever be a single headline number?
I think you will want, the legislation is very strange because Section 21, has an implicit bias built into it that we are free to increase it, but increase the wedge or increase the rate of RPI, but not the other way. So it's a very odd, from a statistical point of view, it's very odd to have that sort of implicit bias built into legislation. I think there will always need to be a very clear framework governing, like all economic statistics. I think if you go away and it's slightly not of this time, but if you went away and looked at the rail franchises, some of them had contracts that depended on the number of people, certainly the London-based ones had contracts depending on the number of people working in London, which was based on statistics produced by the ONS. So it's not just inflation that sometimes gets into contracts, even other things do. So I think you will want a strong framework. It is just an oddity that we have the RPI as the only statistic in law, and obviously that fetters the development or the statistical development. But you will always want a solid framework because you need people to understand kind of what you're measuring and and kind of why and on what basis, because you want people to have faith in your numbers. But again, as I said, I think if you're an investor looking at the UK and UK gilts, then that same argument plays for the public finances. You want rigorous public finance statistics to allow you to do a risk-based assessment of whether to buy into UK gilts. So sometimes I think because the link is so clear, that we've got index-linked gilts and we've got a number. But I would say a lot of economic statistics have similar properties of being absolutely key to decision making, and therefore you need a strong framework. Now, I think in the UK we're lucky because we've got an independent ONS, and we in legislation it says we must be guided by statistical principles. You've got a strong framework that should help you get there. So I think you need the framework, but I don't think you necessarily need legislation if you've got a strong independent statistical system.
I mean, if I could add to that, please. No, you raised the question of experimental statistics and index-linked gilts, and I must say I find it, impossible to imagine the government issuing indexed gilts on a prospectus that says they'll be linked to an experimental statistic. So in that sense, the statistical framework that we have, where experimental statistics are exactly that, and national statistics are something rather different, something that is well established, I think is very helpful.
Where do we see the direction of travel now? You've not only got CPI, you've also got CPIH, and we've yet to finally kill off RPI. Is the direction of travel still very much to end up trying to push all the official readings onto CPIH?
So, I mean, the reason we tend to lead with that is its sort of comprehensiveness. And we completely understand it's not used as the monetary policy instrument. But, if people are asking, what is inflation across the UK? What are people facing? It was always a bit. We found when we sort of sat down and said, well, actually, if you're asking what inflation is, you want to include owner-occupied housing costs. So it was kind of, that was our thinking, was around comprehensiveness. Now, we've been in some ways, we're in it's almost like the opposite of where we were with RPI and RPIX. Because CPI became before CPIH, we're actually, that was simply because owner-occupied housing, it can be quite complicated. In many ways, it's kind of, there is a parallel, I think, between CPI and RPIX and CPIH and RPI. So I think there's a bit of a sort of, some of that I think is just a sort of quirk of timing. But as I said, we report CPIH and you can get all the sort of sub indices and all the analysis for that. But as I said, in terms of, it just struck us as odd that if you were going to ask what do you think inflation is, your first answer wouldn't be, well, inflation excluding homeowners' costs is X, because that's what you'd be saying if you answered it just with CPI. So that was kind of why we took that particular decision. But the one thing we're also very clear about is and something we don't want to get into is sort of saying what we think the uses of that is. We describe the properties and what they are, what they measure. And then it's for the government. The government could set an inflation target based on the price of fish. If it wanted to, so I think that's kind of where we've been getting. And I think there is a tension, and Martin's already hinted at this, that you want different measures because you want to describe different aspects of the economy, but it's also can be very confusing for users when there are lots and lots of measures and kind of which one is right. And, do I worry about the highest one or the lowest one? And sometimes, certainly in the political debate, politicians of both sides sides can see is on what the highest number, maybe not necessarily the most meaningful number. So you'd sometimes have to be very careful with the presentation of economic statistics. But again, I sometimes think it's about a communication tool, and I don't want to suppress data because we think it's, somebody might misuse it. That seems to be the wrong way to go. It's kind of let's try and make it as difficult as possible for people to use the wrong measure for the wrong item.
Well, I mean, one thing that we do need to remember is that the House of Lords report was very critical of the government policy of index shopping, choosing the one that was, most appropriate in financial terms for whatever purpose they had in mind. And of course, the more varieties you have available, the greater the risk of index shopping, unless they're presented very clearly. If I can offer perhaps what I understood to be, a view at the Bank of England some years back, so whether it's still current or not, I don't know. I think the general sense was that you wanted a price index which included owner-occupied housing. Of course, as we know, the owner-occupied or the CPIH had some problems over statistical accuracy, and I could imagine now, well, chancellors have perhaps bigger worries, but in any case, following the past experience, letting it settle down for some time would seem to be obvious sense before making the change. But unless thinking has changed a great deal on the issue, I suspect that there will eventually be a change to CPIH as the target.
It is one lesson to take away, if we think of it in the ESCoE context, is just how long the lags are from improving statistics to having those measures widely adopted.
I think there is there can be, and again, I think it's, I think that's been a criticism of the past, and absolutely true, is kind of, you spend ages developing it, and 5 years after the event you have the perfect measure. I think what we are trying to do and where we're trying to get to is, in some cases, and I don't know if you heard sort of Greg at the end on the sort of, is kind of, in some cases we have taken more risks, and in our labour market statistics we lead with the RTI, the PAYE or RTI data, because we think that's probably the most, in terms of employment numbers, that's probably the most meaningful number at the moment, because it's kind of people in paid employment. We kind of know what it is. Doesn't capture everything and everybody, but we sort of kind of know what it is. So I think you will end up with a sort of potentially more complex world of, and again, if you look at our labour market release, we've completely changed the presentation of that. The order and what you see in there is completely different to what you saw before. And as I said, but having said that, some of the framework and the concepts behind it, so when we were talking about unemployment versus inactivity versus employment, those things are really fundamental concepts, and they correlate nicely with what's going on in the they're interested, they have economic resonance, so they're good concepts and they're helpful to us. So I think you'll end up with a good framework, and the concepts remain the same. I think we will just have to make certain that we don't, Charlie Bean sometimes said we were prisoners of frameworks. We could only see things through frameworks, and I think it's kind of, the frameworks are there and they need to be there, and it's back to that sort of structural issue. But if you need a short-term indicator that tells you what's going on now, get a short-term indicator that tells you what's going on now. It may not last. We'll, in two or 3 years' time, we'll be measuring footfall of the high street in quite the same way we are measuring it now. I would hope not. But so I for me, it's kind of, I think, don't think about what's good about the frameworks. Is it, international comparability? People want international comparability. That's not going away. If anything, it's going to get stronger. People want consistency over time. If you're somebody like the Office for Budget Responsibility and you're trying to put together a macro forecasting model and a fiscal forecasting model, you want some consistency over time. So those sort of things never go away. and I'm just being told I have to disappear off this call shortly. So apologies.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
So that's kind of where I sort of think we'll be. And this idea of experimental, we've done sort of things that previously we would have debated for ages and published lots of methodological papers, and we've just put stuff out. Now, and I think that for me, that's been a good thing, because that's what we'll need to do in the future.
Just a final question, as you mentioned the labour market data. We've had this switch where you've had to resort to telephone conversations and those people you can reach. And you said in your own releases that you're tend to reach more homeowners.
Yeah.
The risk it's distorting the data.
Yeah.
Are we at risk of having a fundamental problem here because we're not reaching the renter sector, we're not reaching the younger people?
So, the data collection issues and around the labour force survey, as I said, they were one of my top risks early on. We've got some mitigation. We can't change kind of how we're collecting, and we're trying to do more. We have something called knock to nudge, where rather than send people into people's homes to interview them, we knock on their door and say, you should have received a letter inviting you to this. Can you answer the phone, or can we take your phone number so we can contact you? Things like that. So we've been trying to be innovative around that. But this is back to another point I made in my closing remarks. This is kind of then about how you triangulate the data. So how does our data relate to administrative data? How does it relate to online data we're seeing? How does it relate to, again, administrative data, one of the ones the Institute for Employment Studies done, how does our redundancy data compare with the HR1 data that the Insolvency Service has? So some of it has been triangulating. Our view at the moment is that the headline numbers, there is more uncertainty than normal. That the headline numbers are pretty reasonable, but I think some of the breakdown, I think your point is most valid, is in some of the breakdowns. So if we are getting more homeowners and fewer renters, does that mean, for example, we're getting fewer non-UK citizens answering it, as they're more likely to be renters? So there will be some particular issues where I think we will find the LFS is under strain. At the same time as doing that, the other bit of triangulation we've done is we've stood up an online labour market survey. Again, won't be perfect, but again, the question here is the more data sources you can bring together, the more likely you are to get that. So labour market survey certainly remains a labour force survey certainly remains a concern for us. At the moment, the headline numbers seem reasonable. It's much more challenging when you get to some of the breakdowns, and of course those breakdowns are very important. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to belittle them, but they are more challenging.
That's brilliant, Jonathan. Do go if you got to go.
Yeah, I'm afraid I do. I've got one more call to make before the weekend, so look, I need to do that. Okay.
For your weekend.
Thank you
so much for your time.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi there.
Hello.
Just to go back on something, which I think the last time we spoke on this was the early days. We're talking about the new baskets and the effects. What we didn't discuss is what the magnitude of the effects was in the sign. We were unsure whether the COVID baskets would end up showing higher inflation, lower inflation than the headline measures. How confident are we now about the magnitude and the sign? I mean, I noticed you have Cavallo and others Dybird and Fox have published papers on this. In general, they argue your lived inflation, your COVID basket is higher, but then it's not consistent. It does vary country by country. What's your feeling about how much progress we've made on this?
Well, no, I wish you'd advised me of that question in advance, because I would have looked at the paper the ONS published in August, which, as far as I can see, does answer that question for the United Kingdom.
Right.
And I'm sure, the discussion we had on real-time weights and so on, I'm sure Jonathan would agree that it's not a perfect answer, but the ONS have done the best they can. And no, my memory is that the numbers aren't actually terribly different, although the composition was different. No, some of the components moved in rather different ways.
Do you see any underlying intrinsic bias in the way these things are done? I'm thinking there that the COVID baskets against the outside measures.
Well, I do worry perhaps a bit more than Jonathan that there might be a bias in using the lagged weights. Well, we can be almost certain that there's a bias because when prices go up, people typically reduce their purchases of the things that have gone up. And in any fixed weight index, that doesn't show up. Obviously, it gets more acute if you're using weights from 10 years ago or 50 years ago than if you're using weights from last year or the year before. But no, if you have short-term movements in prices, then you are likely to, short-term erratic movements in prices, then you are likely to be overstating inflation when, say, the price of fuel goes up. Now, of course, if they are erratic and short-term, then, as Jonathan said, you might say that in the broad sweep of things, it comes out in the wash, and that's probably true, but people do pay attention to short-term numbers as well.
Got it. And just a final one, Martin, thanks again for your time. It's been excellent. Is there any other topic certainly on the inflation front here that you think we should be highlighting? If we compare where we were when the COVID pandemic started and now, lessons you've learned or developments that have spring to mind that we should highlight? Well,
I suppose, no, from my perception, the pandemic and the response to it, I mean, again, to repeat that we don't know what's coming over the next few weeks, but so far it's been much less disruptive than I had feared. There were problems with food supply because people were shopping on a big scale in March and early April, but those have largely gone now. And what's been happening over the last few weeks is that people have been consuming less of the things that they might consume because of the risks associated with that, rather than because it's impossible. So, in that sense, it is easy to think that the epidemic could have been much more disruptive and made the statistical problems that we've been talking about much more acute.
Got it. That's absolutely perfect summary. Listen, that's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Yes.
Could I just add one thing to your question about renters and homeowners?
Please do.
That in principle, the responses are weighted. You try and work out how many people each respondent represents. So if you know the total number of renters and you know the total number of homeowners, then you can increase the weight on the renters you do find to make up for the fact that you're getting fewer of them. Of course, you can only take that so far. If you had only one person in that category, they'd have an enormous influence on the overall aggregate, and you wouldn't want that to happen. There have been some statistical disasters from that sort of thing happening without people realizing. But for relatively small fluctuations, you can compensate at least to some extent with movements in weights. What you can't do is get such a good picture once you start looking at the detail, and that was Jonathan's point.
Got it. Got it. And that assumes that you have a pre-existing understanding of the share of renters and the share of homeowners.
Well, we would have a better understanding of that if the census had been last year than if it had been it being in 2011, because one of the reasons for needing a large census is, and I mean, I understand it won't go on in its recent form beyond next year, but historically one of the reasons for needing a large census is that it provides the sort of infrastructure for working out how many people there are in each sort of category so that you can adjust sample surveys in the way I've described.
Got it. Got it. That's really clear. Anything else, or does that cover everything?
I think on those issues that covers everything. But if you do have a look at the ESCoE material, one presentation I draw your attention to in particular was by Leo Nakamura, who was arguing that GDP is growing quite a lot faster than we measure, and therefore inflation must be quite a lot lower. And he, I wouldn't say I'm completely persuaded, but he certainly did put forward some very good arguments.
I think I attended his presentation at ESCoE. He did one at the ONS, indeed.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. I will take a look at it. That's excellent. Martin, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, thank you for your interest in the conference.
Brilliant. And do have a good weekend. Yeah.
And you.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. Bye.